So let's talk economy this morning. I mean, it concerns you and I, so there's no shying away from this one. We're joined on the program, as you've seen, right here in our Lagos studio by Mr. Paul Igbinoba, who is an economist and team lead at ProServe Options Consulting. It's right in our Lagos studio. And virtually on Zoom this morning is Mr. Taiwo Oyedele. He's an economist and Africa tax leader, PwC. He's right there in his car. In traffic, I mean, that of course impacts on the economy as well. Mr. Oyedele, it's good to have you on the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's start here in our Lagos studio. Thank you for joining us, sir. And I mean, this latest decision by the MPC, I mean, some think it's the CBN, but it's really a committee made up of different members, and they've decided yet again to hike the MPR 100 basis points. And I'd like you to speak to this point, because there's the MPC's decision, the interest rate at that level, and what Nigerians feel, which is inflation, which is a major issue. So we've seen inflation taper down by just 13 basis points, that's 0.13% over the past 11 months. But we've seen the MPR, the interest rate, rise over the past 9 months. I mean, by 600 basis points, 6 points. So they don't look alike. 6% increase in the interest rate, 0.13% drop in inflation rate. So the question will be then, is this really the silver bullet we need to tackle our inflation in Nigeria? The MPR, that's interest rate.
Well, I don't think the word silver bullet is probably the most appropriate thing to use here. Because let's face it, Central Bank of Nigeria is actually targeting inflation for good reasons, really. Because we have a double-digit inflation rate. Like you said, just slightly reduced from 21.47 in November to 21.34 in December. You know, and before that time, the CBN MPR was CBN monetary policy rate was 16.5%, yeah. And the gap between that and the inflation rate was a bit much. All right. Now, if you look at, let's compare ourselves with South Africa and Kenya.
All right.
You discover that inflation rate in South Africa is single digit. So also is their own repo rate. That's their own
interest rate.
Central bank rate, okay, or MPR.
Yeah.
Now, for South Africa, it is 7%. And their interest rate is 7.6%. They are both single digit, and the gap between them is less than 1%. The same is true of Kenya. Kenya's current central bank rate, same as our MPR, is 8.75%. And the inflation rate is 9.5%. Both are single digit, and the gap between them is less than 1%. But the gap between our own MPR, that's the CBN, you know, anchor interest rate, and inflation rate was quite much. As of November, it was 16.5% vis-a-vis 21.47. So what CBN is doing is targeting inflation and trying to reduce that gap between the MPR and the interest rate. Because once interest rate goes, I mean, once
the inflation
rate goes beyond 13%, it becomes quite virulent and quite a great cause for concern for the central bank. So you really cannot blame CBN at this rate for targeting inflation. Of course, it has consequences. It makes borrowing more expensive for the private sector. It leads to a reduction in the rate of investment, all that. But at this particular time, there's great cause for Nigeria. I mean, there's enough reason for central bank to actually target inflation.
Okay, let's bring in Mr. Oyedele, because I want Nigerians to understand how these things work together, the interplay between the MPR, interest rate, if you call it, and the inflation, which is at least a major reason why we see some of these changes. If we will not say MPR increased by 6% before we saw this latest inflation drop. Let's say 5%, because before this latest decision, it will have been 5% over the past, what is it, 7 or 8, 9 months. And we saw that 0.13%. And I'll ask the same question in another light. Do we need to be doing something more such that if we're seeing the interest rates at least being tightened by that much, 5%, we can also see some commensurate drop in inflation? If 5% is too much to ask, well, let's even say 3%. What may we be missing here, Mr. Oyedele?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, a good starting point for me is to interrogate what is the problem we have and what are the prescriptions that we are trying to administer. So yes, I do agree. Inflation is something you have to control. One of the primary objectives of the central bank or monetary authorities more broadly is price stability. Because if you allow inflation to get out of hand, what that means is there will be crisis, actually. People will get into poverty, cost of living will become unbearable, and it can bring down any government, even if it's a dictatorship. So it's something that government wants to control. But the important question you ask is, so this interest rate that we have been increasing consistently over the past months, now 600 basis points, yet we see only a very slight moderation in inflation rates. So what are the issues? So in my view, if you think about what's causing our inflation, even the CBN, the MPC, I should say, alluded to this. So you have things like energy costs. So the cost of energy, particularly diesel, has gone up, by around 400% in the past 12 months. We are dealing with scarcity of petrol now as we speak across the country. Not only is that increasing, the cost, it also means that you can't even get enough for you to do production, and that reduces capacity. So anything that reduces productivity and production is also adding to inflation. And then on another hand as well, you have cost push inflation where, logistic cost is rising, input costs are rising because of exchange rate problem and scarcity. A lot of people who import, inputs and materials are relying on the parallel market at about 750 Naira to the dollar. So these are adding to the pressure on inflation. Now, when you raise interest rates like the MPR, we need to think about it, differently. On one hand, it's a reference rate. It does not even mean that's the interest rate that people would pay. So as we speak today, the interest rate on treasury bills, the yield, is around 2 to 4%. The interest rate on savings, if you have a savings account, is around 4%. Even on government bond, you are talking about around 11 to 13%. Government is even planning to issue the 40-year bond to securitize the ways and means, and they are looking at 9%. So you have been raising the MPR, but it's not reflecting in the market. And the question again is, in many countries where you use interest rates more effectively, those economies rely so much on credit. So imagine today that you have a mortgage, for your house where you are paying repayments on a monthly basis. When interest rate goes up, the amount you have to pay also goes up. Now, the other thing that you also find is because you have the credit in your hand and the interest rate you are paying on it is higher, you reduce your consumption and it starts to moderate, inflation rate. And those who have surplus money and they are not relying on credit, when the interest rate is going up, that means the amount they can earn on their savings goes up. So the propensity to save also increases. When you combine these together, it will then reduce consumption and demand and then begin to moderate inflation. But that is not the case in Nigeria. So we don't have credit, almost zero. And then people don't really have surpluses. And even when they do, who is inspired by saving at 4% when inflation is around 20%? So these reasons are the explanation, in my view, why even though we continue to increase the MPR, the impact on inflation has been almost insignificant.
Yeah, Mr. Gwinoba, I'd like you to, react to some of the things that he has raised, that Mr. Oyedele. Specifically, he says that the decision to continue to raise MPR has had little significance on the real market, and he quoted treasury bills, interest rate on treasury bills, bank lending rate, government bonds. But if you tie that to the CBN's, reaction, so to speak, to its decisions, the CBN seems to think that its monetary policies are working, and they're citing the minimal reduction in inflation. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the truth is that our economy is in a very difficult situation right now, right? And that's because of so many other factors, political and social and what have you. Evidently, the government doesn't want to borrow at a very high cost, and that's reflecting in the treasury bill rate at a single digit, all right? And that's really not reflective of the rate at which treasury bills ought to be sold. So therefore, okay, like my colleague said, the NPR doesn't reflect at all on that. Okay. Now, government's attempt to even securitize 22.7 or so trillion naira of ways and means is another evidence of a desire to lower its cost of borrowing. Okay. So the Nigerian situation right now is a bit unique and challenging. And let's be honest with ourselves. Even the central bank is under severe pressure, more so historically, more so than before, So the CBN is trying to do its best to cope with all of its challenges and pressures, and that's why things are panning out the way they are. Certainly, the NPR rate has very limited effect on inflation for many reasons, as have been explained by my counterpart. Okay, and the CBN doesn't have control over so many factors. More so that we're moving towards the election. I mean, there's going to be a whole lot of billions of naira of campaign, funding. Mm-hmm. Okay, now also the factor of the Russian-Ukraine war, its effect on fuel price, its effect on food prices, and all that, among other external factors over which the Central Bank of Nigeria has very, very little control. Okay. So, but it would be a lot better if our money market, that's the treasury bill rate was a bit closer to reality in terms of a reflection of supply-demand situation. So the Central Bank of Nigeria really, I'm not their spokesperson, but the reality is that the CBN is under severe pressure and has very limited options. And the effect of the NPR rate on inflation targeting is obviously minimal.
But isn't it unfair to securitize its own lending for the ways and means at 9% over a long period, but other indices, that impact on the ordinary people who need funding for different forms of, businesses, cannot access it at, a reasonable rate?
Well, as you're aware, the federal government has borrowed trillions and trillions of funds. I mean, of Naira. Its total ways and means portfolio is about 23 trillion Naira. And now the World Bank predicts that this year alone, Nigeria will spend 123.4% of its total revenue to service debts. So what we have in our hands actually is a fiscal crisis. Though government will not easily admit that, it's a fiscal crisis. A situation where your debt service alone will be more than your total revenue for the year. So the government is just doing all they can to manage that situation. Now, to securitize ways and means of 22.7 trillion is unprecedented. It has never happened before. And I don't know any other country in the world where that has happened. But again, it's just an attempt by government to do all they can to reduce its debt servicing of, costs. But the problem overall is basically the fact that the federal government has been very reluctant to apply time-tested policies, market-oriented, policies that would have eased its own financial obligations.
Why do you think that they're not making those decisions which you think they should
Well,
make?
it's an ideological fixation. That's how I put it, all right? Because the federal government or the president is not inclined to allow market forces to take control in various markets. Foreign exchange, for example, okay, the downstream oil and gas, essentially the issue of
Subsidy?
petrol subsidy. Now, if the government can develop, well, of course, I mean, its tenure is almost over. If the current regime has developed the political will to allow market forces determine prices, the huge pressure on the budget caused by trillions of naira of subsidy would have eased government's would have eased government's fiscal pressure tremendously. And all of these unconventional, unorthodox strategies to minimize debt servicing and all that wouldn't have, occurred. And again, if Nigeria has been, if the CBN had been able to, just let market forces determine the exchange rate, you would have seen over time a quantum inflow of foreign exchange that would have eased even the naira dollar in exchange rate,
But they
and then have a positive effect on inflation and prices.
Okay. Very important points you have raised there, particularly when it comes to the forex and subsidy. It looks like the government has made some sort of decision on subsidy, even though it left it till after its administration in June, saying it will end. We don't know what the president that comes in will do with that one, whether or not it will be sustained. But some important points you raised, and I'd like to bounce that off Mr. Oyedele quickly. Government governance, as it is about making tough decisions, ultimately decisions that will favor the people. Some points have been raised about the ways and means, which some people say, maybe that's even the real issue that we should be dealing with when we're talking about inflation. But then some say, what option does government have, really? You need these funds to ensure you do something. So, I mean, you can't run a government broke, so you need to get the money from somewhere. Some other points have been raised. But in terms of the will to make those decisions, perhaps on the fiscal side, would you say that government has really made those tough decisions, bearing in mind the masses, as they say?
So what we are going through today are mostly the outcome of the decisions we made in the past and the decisions we failed to make also in the past. But I also have to say to you that even the decisions we're making now that would impact the outcome we will get tomorrow are also not, in my view, the most optimal decisions. I have to admit it's difficult. It's not like there's a silver bullet anywhere to solve all the problems. But if you think about it from different perspectives, on one hand, monetary authorities are really limited in terms of tools available to them. Create cash reserve ratio, a bit of FX. What else can you do? Not so much, right? You need to then complement it with fiscal policies. So if you have about 10 trillion naira, and then you have ways and means that is now around 24 trillion, those are very expansionary policies that are capable of fueling inflation. So you are using one hand to try and control inflation. On the other hand, you are fueling it yourself as government. based on the policies you introduce. I would admit, so every country, almost every country in the world, we use ways and means. They use CBN overdraft, CBN financing, they call it all manners of names, which essentially, if you ask to say, where does it come from? You mostly use the cash reserve ratio. When people take their monies to the bank, you say to the bank, by the way, you cannot do whatever you please with all the money that you have received from customers. You must bring a percentage and keep it with me as the central bank mandatorily. So you limit the amount that's available to banks to create credit, right? You can give that to government to spend. If that is not enough, you simply just print the Naira. So when you do all of these, you fuel inflation. The question is, what else could you have done if you don't have the money? A number of things. Number one is government spending priorities. Right. I say to myself, we know that governments around the world struggle with doing business efficiently. It's even twice as bad in a country like Nigeria. Why did we have to borrow, for example, for the refineries, over $1.5 billion? We know that these refineries haven't worked. We are all hoping and praying that Dangote refinery will come on stream, and that should help with that. On another hand, you see other expenses like government wants to build this, government wants to build that. Look at Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. We've been on it for 12 years, if not more, and we borrowed the money, and yet we've not finished the project. So it becomes more expensive every time. You are doing variation. You don't pay contractors on time. They come back for adjustment due to exchange rates. So spending priority for me is an issue where we could have saved a lot of money by providing the conducive environment for the private sector to fund a lot of these viable capital projects so that government will focus its lean resources on social services. Another thing is, in terms of even revenue generation, we haven't made the effort. And I'm one of the people who consistently speak to this. If you want to increase Nigeria's tax revenue by over 100%, and I repeat that again, over 100% in just 1 years,
Oh dear.
of agencies of government collecting revenue, 63 MDAs that have been asked to go and collect revenue, when you could have harmonized that.
Yes. Pardon me, we missed that point you were trying to make just at the start of it. We need to talk about how the traffic affects the economy, but please make that point from the scratch about how to increase revenue 100%.
Yes, so my point is that what government needs to do to increase revenue by 100% or even more, my 100% is very conservative. You said, tough decisions. I think that there are even easy decisions that haven't been made. One of it is harmonization. Harmonization simply means, why do you ask 63 MDAs, all manners of other agencies, to collect revenue when only one authority, which is the FRS, can collect the revenue? What's happening with that multiplicity of collecting agency is, one, you have inefficiency of collection. People pay more, government collect less because you also have corruption embedded into the whole process. Some of them use consultants and they pay commissions more now to do, and then harmonize, create the apathy.
Oh dear, we seem to be having audio
absolutely.
there.
We'll try to fix that and ensure that we get that point, because I was trying to speak to how it's important to harmonize revenue collection. But we're due for break in just less than a minute. But perhaps you also agree with the point he was making, particularly with revenue collection. The FIRS recently broke the record in terms of revenue collection.
Yes.
So do you align with him on that point?
Well, certainly. I mean, even then, the FIRS is trying its best. They just hit 10 trillion Naira recently,
in collection, yeah.
Which is quite remarkable. But I mean, he is talking from the point of view of a tax expert. He knows exactly what's going on. There's a need for a whole lot of efficiency in tax administration in Nigeria.
Right.
So centralizing tax collection on the FIRS will certainly reduce the cost of tax administration and increase tax revenue.
Okay, we're discussing the economy. It concerns you, believe it or not. And we still have here in our Lagos studio Mr. Paul Ebinoba, and joining us virtually Mr. Taiwo Yedele. And lots of issues to raise, so I'll just yield to my colleague Bukola to take this up.
Yeah, thank you, Kadi. Mr. Oyedele was talking about something very important just before the break, harmonizing revenue collection. And rising from its meeting yesterday, the NESG, one of the speakers talked about tax harmonization, about 66 official taxes, 200 unofficial, yet only 10 get to the federal government. So, Mr. Gunaba, what reforms would you be recommending in this regard, such that, revenue collection in this sector can be more efficient and more transparent and accountable?
Well, it all goes back to the political will by government to streamline this, what they call it harmonization or streamlining. We just need to streamline the whole process of revenue collection. Make tax collection more cost effective. All right? So that is it. But then it is a legacy problem. I mean, we have this so many agencies for a long time, and it will take government quite some time to harmonize and streamline. But that's the way to go. Because doing that, we reduce the cost of tax administration, and we generate a whole lot more revenue.
And you rightly observed that, it's unprecedented that the FIRS was able to collect 10 trillion naira.
Exactly.
Relate that to the other revenues from non-oil sources that, have been announced to have been collected. So why does the federal government, in the light of all these revenues, still has to borrow to fund the budget? 10 trillion naira is half the 2023 budget.
Yeah, but that's just half of 21.8 trillion. Government this year alone is borrowing about 10 trillion naira. I mean that's the value of the budget deficit, 10 trillion. All right? And debt service will be 6.55 trillion. So certainly we are not generating enough revenue. So there's no way government will not borrow.
But there can be a bit more efficiency there.
Yes, the fact remains that a whole lot of things that, like Mr. Oyedele said, many things that government is doing, they don't need to do. You can privatize a whole lot of these things and bring in private sector initiatives and investments and streamline government spending to reduce its overall spending.
All right. So we have Mr. Oyedele back. I see that the connection is good. I'm happy about that. So, Mr. Oyedele, we've always thought that, politics is about making policies that are in line with the simple, the simple rules of economy. I mean, allow the market, for example, take control. It will decide the prices, and eventually we'll begin to see perhaps a price drop, the usual demand and supply and all of that. But it would seem that the politics is actually against the policies, because it would look like some decisions are actually political, okay, not economical. They don't make economic sense. So is that what you also mean? I mean, you can land on the point you were making earlier, but in terms of the will, because it looks like, I mean, we take a few steps forward and lots of steps backward and not dealing with the real issue. So is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. The way the political system would always influence the economic system, and politicians are usually not, the people who make the most optimal decision, because they tend to prioritize politics over the economy. So some of the issues affecting the price of goods and services include fiscal policy decisions like, import restrictions. So you decide that I cannot import rice because politically speaking, it's good to say you are producing locally. And nobody is really giving us the data about how much is our consumption, how much are we producing, so that maybe we say you can still continue to import, but only for the gap that you are not producing currently, so that way the pressure on price is also reduced. In addition to the fact that we said you have this huge borrowing that is deficit financed, mostly from the CBN. So when you need to make those decisions, you have to think about what's best for the economy in the short, medium, and long term. And I don't think that anybody is going to lose their elections just because of that. It was unthinkable 4 years ago to expect that someone who is contesting to be president of Nigeria will tell you that they're going to remove first subsidy. But today, all the three leading candidates have said that they're going to remove first subsidy. And I don't see anybody who said, oh, I was going to vote for you before until you said you remove fresh subsidy. So if the reason why prices are going up is to do with scarcity of energy, particularly now petrol, and then the expensive diesel that we buy, as well as the increase in cost of importation because of FX rates. In addition to that, you ask yourself, what is it that Nigerians are really buying? When you have 1.3 million people in multidimensional poverty, data shows that between 80 to 120% of household income is spent on food. So if you increase the MPR to 100%, people will not stop eating because all that they have is what they are using to feed their family, and many of them can't even have 3 square meals a day. So you find that at the end of the day, if you continue to raise the interest rates without really balancing it within the context of our economy, you may actually be fueling inflation rather than controlling inflation.
So Mr.
When it
Oyedele,
comes to question, yes.
So, Mr. Oyedele, the back and forth between the National Assembly and the CBN, is it a conflict of politics and policy?
I think it's mostly lack of understanding. I do think that the National Assembly don't fully understand ways and means. And I'll tell you why I say that. So first, the lawmaker said, well, we did not approve this spending. And I said, why would you say you did not approve this spending? You passed a budget that had a deficit of 7 trillion. I think it was for last year. For 2023, the budget deficit is over 10 trillion. You already approved it. What you have said to the executive is, I allow you to spend 10 trillion more than you are going to make. Where are they supposed to go and get the money? So they can either issue bonds to borrow locally, or they can do Euro bond. They wanted to go to the international market for Euro bond. The rates were just too high, and they couldn't go ahead with the Euro bond. So they were left with the local market. Now, do you have sufficient liquidity in the local market to fund it? Maybe not. And then you went to the CBN. So the question is not whether you authorize spending. Did that already. The question is that you did not. What we should have done before, we want to go and borrow from the people, from the market, and we use that money to pay the central bank back the amount we took from them. So that conversation, I think for me, should not be.
All right, apologies there. We lost Mr. Oyedele again. But let me go to you, Mr. Igbinoba. Give us your thoughts on this currency deadline. It's been going back and forth between the National Assembly and the CBN. It appears they summoned him again, along with Bankers Committee. Now, the World Bank did caution some time ago, saying international experience does suggest that this rapid demonetization can indeed, come or yield or cause a lot of this pressure, especially given the fact that lots of businesses, small-scale businesses, depend on a day-to-day basis, and so there could be liquidity squeeze, which may affect the economy. What do you think about that?
Well, basically, I think the CBN should be allowed to do its work. All right, they've committed to 31st of January. And I think they will, by and large, deliver on it. So I want to suggest that the National Assembly should just let the central bank do its work. Now, they may not be able to have a perfect score by the 31st, but I can assure you that they would have done met most of their target, Like they said, people in the villages and all that, okay, there will be some little allowance here and there. But the bulk of people who actually are holding cash are not those small-scale people. They're not the people in the villages. They are the urban-based business people and politicians. And they have enough time to return, cash in their old Naira notes. All right. See, but in Nigeria, we used to a whole lot of sentiments. How can you tell CBN to extend the deadline for you know, for the new Naira notes to be implemented by 6 months. That's very unrealistic. So, but I'm glad that for once, a government agency is focused on getting things done, you know, the way it should be done. They're giving a deadline. Let us just allow them. Let's cooperate. If you have 100 million Naira or billion, take it to the bank, please. Simple. I mean, I think somehow...
Well, you know, when you say that they may have, what, not 100%, and you give it some score, what does that actually mean? Because if you're given a deadline, it's either you meet your 100%, because if you say they will not meet it 100%, are you suggesting that for those who may not be able to meet up with the currency swap deadline, the other percentage, you forget about the rest of their money? What exactly do you mean by it may not be 100%?
Essentially, what I'm saying is this. The people who, by and large, hold the bulk of the old Naira notes are people who are based in the urban areas. They are businessmen, politicians, and other high net worth individuals who have access to banking facilities. Let them just play ball, cooperate with central bank, and let's get this thing done. The remaining little, the fringes, that is people in rural areas and SMEs, what they're holding on to is very minimal. So by and large, central bank will be able to deliver on that target. That is my position.
But so what do we do with, because members of the National Assembly say a lot of them, some even say about over 90%, if I remember properly, of people in their constituency have never seen the new notes. The CBN officials, some of them last week, did this stop and check with some ATMs. They were still dispensing the old notes. As of this morning, some dailies also reported that some ATM, in fact, my colleague Bukola, I think you said that yesterday you tried the ATM in Ikeja. That's the state's capital of Lagos.
Yeah.
They were still dispensing old currency notes. And here we are saying the deadline is January 31. Even though CBN says reject the old notes, how do you reject it when you're taking it from the ATM? So are you suggesting that all of these challenges, it doesn't matter, they will address themselves, or CBN will address it come January 31?
Well, certainly, well, there might eventually be a need for CBN to give some little extension, all right? Possibly a week or two, but certainly not 6 months. You know, I believe that if all stakeholders, you know, are focused on cooperating, most of the remaining old Naira notes outside there can be, you know, deposited in good time. But like in most cases, you know, projects, you may not always meet 100% performance on deadline. So central bank is monitoring, and they might see the need to give a little extension, but certainly not by a month, 2 months, or 6 months.
But, you know, the time, because I've heard lots of people compare this with what happens in other climes. Readily, they will even remind me this morning, they say, look, what about what we see happening in London, for instance? You know, when you are dealing with this kind of scenario, they say, look, that society has, of course, with due respect to us as well, a lot more developed platforms for these kind of exchanges, yet the length of time is so much, almost indefinite. And then we want to do ours within this very short time. And it just suggests as though one asks, is this really well thought out? Because here you are saying, well, there might be need for 1 or 2 more weeks. Doesn't that suggest that way? Just appears as though it's not properly thought out.
Well, the truth is that I don't know the real motivations behind this rather short. I mean, this, of course, we all agree that the whole thing was rather sudden and all that. You know, but given what it is, I'm just saying, let us cooperate with the central bank. And they may eventually need to give some extension. But let us, I get the impression that the people at the National Assembly are not even willing to give central bank, all the necessary cooperation that they need. I mean, how can you be talking about 6 months extension? That to me doesn't make any sense. Okay, there could be 1 month extension or 2 weeks extension, but I believe that if all of us want to get things done as far as meeting this deadline, most people will succeed in doing that, because most of those who have these excess funds or owners are people who have access to banking facilities. So let's cooperate with CBN, because the situation we are in Nigeria is so unusual and so unorthodox. So let's cooperate with them and let's get moving. That is essentially my position.
Speaking of the CBN, Mr. Oyedele, the governor also clarified yesterday that the amount collected in stamp duty between 2016 and now so far has been 370 billion naira. And part of that amount, I think 222 billion, have been disbursed to the Federal Allocations Accounts Committee, and it has only a balance of over 100 billion naira. But if you compare that with the amount quoted by Honorable Kazaure, who had raised that alarm, I think in December last year, that the CBN was illegally withholding 89 trillion naira, it's a far cry. First of all, what are your thoughts on this clarification? And would it be out of place, just for the anti-corruption agencies to take a look at what the records of Honorable Kazaure may be in this regard, just to be sure that, the books are clear and maybe one person is the one that is in the wrong?
Yes, thank you. I think, first and foremost on the, new Naira and the deadline, I do agree. I don't think the conversation is about 6 months. I think the conversation should have been more, robust, because I think the CBN could help of distributing the new notes, on time and widespread across Nigeria, but they didn't do that. So what I expect the lawmakers to do is to 1.2 trillion naira. So how much have you printed in the new currency? How much of what you printed have you circulated? Because you cannot withdraw, maybe 3 trillion from the system and you have not even distributed 1 trillion. That will create problems because we're not going to become cashless overnight. So CBN needs to even provide data. How much is it that you have circulated? Now, to the question of stamp duties, so I have to tell you without doing any analysis, it is impossible to have generated 89 trillion from stamp duties. It is completely impossible. What is the total amount of money in the banking system? So money supply in Nigeria itself is under 50 trillion. All money supply combined, the electronic, cash, and the rest of it. So it's not up to 89 trillion. But should they investigate? I'll say definitely yes. It should be investigated. And it goes back to one of the points I made before. Why is the CBN even having a conversation on stamp duties? Stamp duty is 100% a fiscal matter. It's based on the Stamp Duties Act. What's CBN having to do with that? So it should be an issue to do with the monetary authorities. If banks are collecting stamp duties, they should remit to the tax authority, not to the central bank. So these are some of the things we need to correct. Otherwise, we'll be creating problems for ourselves, and we spend time and energy and resources solving those problems where they could have been prevented in the first place, so that everybody can focus their effort on how do we solve our most important problems that were outside our control to make sure that the economy begins to move in the right direction.
So I recall at the point when that announcement was made, in the statement which the CBN governor and CBN eventually put out, it was said that we had 1.46 trillion naira cash in circulation as at 2015, and then as at last year when that decision was made, it was 3.23 trillion naira. Basically, we were trying to cut down. So just how much, because the question was asked when a representative of the CBN governor was in the National Assembly, that how much has been printed, how much do we have? Well, I imagine that, I think she said at that point that she needed to get the right figures so that we would know. But clearly, it is important to know how much should we be having at least in circulation while we try to move on to that cashless, goal, which, I mean, the government says it is? Do we have the maybe 1 trillion, 2 trillion? If we say that 3.23 trillion is too much, how much cash should we have in circulation? At least, should the CBN have printed?
Yeah, to be honest, money supply in Nigeria is around 50 trillion. Cash in circulation, according to the CBN, is around 3.2 trillion. That's just around about 6%. Even the US, the most developed countries where you say cashless economy is working, educated and all of that, they have far more than that. America has more dollars printed, currency notes in circulation per person on earth than the amount of Naira we have per Nigerian, just to give you an idea. And I don't think anybody worries their head about all of that in the US. So I don't think that money, cash in circulation, is too much, given the size of our economy and relative to the total money supply. What I think the problem is that a bulk, at least according to the CBN, a significant amount of that money are probably in the wrong hands. People who can't explain the sources of their wealth. Some of it are kept in septic tanks in different places, and it makes it difficult for the monetary authorities to control money supply using their available instruments. So that objective for me is actually more important than the cashless economy of let's reduce the amount of cash in circulation, which is why I thought that in implementing that new policy, the monetary authority, CBN in particular, could have been more intentional. For example, when you are bringing that money back to the system, depositing it in your bank account and the rest of it, how much information do you collect about those individuals? In fact, I made a comment when I saw one of the circulars from the CBN to say, there's not even anything about your tax identification number. When you are collecting those, they said there's a limit. If you want to exceed it, bring X, Y, Z information. And there wasn't tax there. Was subsequently that they updated it and included tax in one of the requirements if you are spending a lot of cash.
Right.
And then when you say that you're redesigning Naira, initially was December 15 for the commencement. They even brought it forward. I was so excited. I thought they were so ready. And they launched it earlier than that. From that date that it was launched, it should not be possible for anyone to be paid in the old Naira notes, either through ATM or across the counter at the bank. If you supply enough of it to the banks, they have no incentive to keep giving people the old notes. And as you are giving those new notes, you are not only taking record of who is bringing back the old notes in volumes, you are taking record of who you are paying the new notes to in volumes.
Right.
So that at the end of the day, you can identify all these people with, illicit funds, so you can address that. Well, so that would be my take on that question.
Okay, we have to wind up, but I recall the CBN governor saying you fill loads of forms. In fact, that particular presser, he actually mentioned some of the hurdles that people have to cross in trying to return the money back. But we have to go right now. But on a final note, in 30 seconds, you asked for an extension. You're saying clearly not 6 months, but perhaps some time. There's a fear that the elections, in fact, the CBN governor mentioned it, that the election spending is affecting the economy and inflation as well. Exactly. If there's an extension, wouldn't we lose all of the gains that we thought we had gained with this particular one?
I'm not even advocating for an extension, but I'm just saying, like in any project management, you don't always achieve full target on the set date. So there could be some time overrun. It's entirely left to CBN to determine that.
To make that decision.
Exactly.
But we'll have to thank you so much. The coming days will clearly be interesting. Mr. Paul Igbinoba is an economist and team lead at ProServe Options Consulting. Thank you so much for your time on the program this morning. As well as Mr. Taiwo Oyedele, who's Africa Tax Leader, PwC, also an economist. Thank you for joining us in traffic and for doing it in spite of all of that. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.